and welcome to Talking Books. I'm Jill de Villiers. In May last year, an explosive report was published. It was called Betrayal of the Promise, How South Africa is Being Stolen, and it detailed the systematic nature of state capture. It became the basis of a new book, Shadow State, The Politics of State Capture, written by Ivor Chipkin and Mark Swilling. Joining me today is Professor Ivor Chipkin from the Public Affairs Research Institute at Wits University. Ivor, thank you very much for joining me. Let's talk about the report that first came out. What is the difference between the report and the book?
We've updated the report, so there were some small errors in the original report which we've corrected, and as more information has emerged, we've updated the report on the basis of that new information. And then what we've done, which I think is from my point of view quite exciting, is that we've framed the report in the subsequent events. So there's an introductory chapter, a fairly substantial chapter now, situating the report in the larger civil society movement that I think largely generated the political change from the end of last year, and the role which the report played in that movement. And then there's a preface by obviously Jonas and by Ferrell Huffagy as well as written for it as well. Yeah.
Now, well, the former Deputy Finance Minister, the BC Jonas, in his foreword he mentions that the state capture was dependent on the wounds of apartheid, that the wounds of apartheid sort of initiated this. Can you expand a little bit on that?
So that's interesting, and I think it's a very helpful framing to situate what we're currently experiencing or what we've been through in relationship to our past. Precisely because what it does, it puts the accent on the political dimension of state capture. The reporting from last year, and in many cases sometimes is still the case, is that state capture is reported as primarily or overwhelmingly a phenomenon related to corruption and theft and fraud. Mm-hmm. Now, of course, those dimensions are key to it. But what we argued in the Betrayal of the Promise report and in the new book is that fraud and corruption has to be situated in the context of what we argue is a political project which emerges from 2007, especially around after the events of Polokwane. And what it is, and this is why Jonas's remarks are so important, is an attempt to come to terms with the legacy of the apartheid political economy. And what the Zuma project represents is an attempt to transform the South African economy, but understanding, and this is the key argument, that the constitutional settlement of 1994 is actually a problem, is an obstacle to that change. Mm-hmm. And so what we argue in the book is that the Zuma administration sets itself up against the constitutional framework and in terms of the settlement of 1994 in order to achieve what it calls radical economic transformation. Mm-hmm. And this is really the key, the hallmark of state capture. It's a political project which in the name of radical economic transformation turns against the settlement of 1994, turns against the South African Constitution and seeks to undermine constitutional bodies.
Now that ball got rolling, and once it got rolling it couldn't be stopped, but is there anything that could have prevented it from happening?
We did prevent it from happening in the end. I mean, I think that's what's so exciting. Mm-hmm. And I think so this is what one has to, I mean, as devastating as the last 10 years have been and as demoralizing as the current situation all seems, there's also much to be optimistic about. Several key institutions held, the Public Protector, some of the constitutional bodies held firm, the Public Protector, for example. Our high courts, the Constitutional Court and our high courts were not captured, held firm, some really pioneering judgments in that regard. Independent media, especially the legacy of the sort of independent media from the apartheid period, now situated in places like Amabungani and Daily Maverick, doing sterling, courageous work, exposing some of the issues. And then what I'm really excited about was that in the course of 2017, there was a remobilization of democratic civil society. Not just the old UDF networks coming to life, although many of them were, but also liberal organizations, business organizations coming to the party, new alliances, new configurations of organizations coming together. And that I think is very, very exciting, because what it shows to me anyway, within civil society, there's still fire in the animal.
So you think that all of this would then mean that this is not likely to happen again?
No, I wouldn't say that. What I would say, though, is that there is a solid, I don't know if it's how powerful it is, but there's nonetheless a solid, and we'll see going forward how powerful it is. There is a solid democratic constituency in South Africa, one still committed to the constitution, still committed to democracy. Having said that, there are incredibly powerful forces in South Africa opposed to that kind of politics. I think the danger of state capture is that what it surfaced is that this is a political response to the ongoing character of South Africa's political economy. Massive inequality, massive economic exclusion of largely black South Africans. And as long as we do not find ways of dealing with that legacy, of dealing with that situation in economic policy, etc., the temptation of bypassing and jettisoning the constitutional framework and of democracy will always be there. So as long as we are not seen to be tackling head on that legacy, I think state capture is always going to be...
And how do you see that being tackled? How should it be done?
Well, there are a whole range of areas. My area is in sort of public administration. So what I think has been shown up is state capture has revealed quite fundamental weaknesses in the organisation of government, which I think we need to address. But I think some much more work needs to be done around what it takes to transform our economy and to reconcile two imperatives: serious economic transformation. It cannot carry on as it is now. Ongoing reproduction of wealth amongst a tiny minority and vast economic exclusion for the majority. That is unsustainable for South Africa. So we have to find ways of transforming the economy, generating inclusive growth, but also in a way that is reconciled to our democracy and our constitutional framework. And this is where I think we need serious policy thinking and policy debate in economic space. The tendency in South Africa, as far as I see it, though, is that we fall back on kind of ideological or dogmatic ideological positions, whether it's from whatever ideological spectrum they may be, and we're not actually engaging around meaningful debate about what it will take to produce change.
Now, the radical economic transformation was really, the idea behind it was very solid and very good, but it was taken beyond what it was meant to do. And it also brought in the white capital debate,
right.
and really skewed it. Do you think that we can now get through it? Because a lot of people had put their minds into this very blinkered way of thinking.
Look, I mean, I think it raised then and raises still today some very profound questions. So, white monopoly capital, or the dominance of white firms in the economy, I think we have to take seriously. And I think what it produced at Polokwane, the Polokwane revolt within the ANC, which elects Jacob Zuma as the ANC president, is based on a fundamental critique and rejection of the Thabo Mbeki years. And what are the Thabo Mbeki years, we argue? Essentially, it's the idea that the existing white business can somehow be cajoled, pressurized, incentivized through black economic empowerment measures, through affirmative action measures, to somehow transform itself. And by 2007, the sense is, and I think the evidence is very strong to support this, that project has largely failed. Business has not come on board to the party. And what we start seeing within the ANC, but especially within government, is a search for other kinds of models of economic transformation. ANC Youth League, which eventually becomes the policy of the EFF, for example, it returns to the kind of 1950s model of nationalization. But within other parts of the ANC, but especially within government, within the Department of Trade and Industry, a whole range of other ideas are beginning to circulate. Looking back to the model of sort of Afrikaner economic empowerment of an earlier period, they're looking at the state-owned enterprises, and especially their procurement budgets, as a way of generating a new kind of black-owned and black-controlled economy. And the idea is this: by using the procurement budgets of, in particular, Eskom and Transnet, where there's huge amounts of money each year, to do two things: to displace the hold of existing white companies, and to also incentivize and encourage the emergence of new black-owned and black-controlled companies. And you can see that these ideas are very, very compelling and they're very exciting. They resonate at the time with the language of the developmental state. But most importantly, here is a model of economic transformation that does not depend on white business somehow coming to the party. And you can understand why there's such excitement and such enthusiasm for these ideas. What we argue, though, is that from around 2012, the project of radical economic transformation itself radicalizes. And it begins to understand, I think incorrectly, that project cannot be prosecuted within the framework of South Africa's laws and within the framework of the Constitution. And as a result, we argue that there's a space of legitimacy that emerges for actions which step outside the law, which become illegal, and outside the constitutional framework. And what that does is it generates increasingly transactions happening through the state-owned enterprises which are illegal and increasingly are becoming criminal.
So rent-seeking then becomes acceptable?
It's exactly that. Rent-seeking, and I think there are kinds of rent-seeking which can be understood as positive. And what we see here is a project of rent-seeking which becomes criminal. Yeah.
So how big is the extent of this? How large is it? Do we really understand it fully, or is it still going to emerge?
I think the State Capture Commission is going to start giving us a better sense of the scale of it. I think figures are being bandied around. I heard Praveen Gordhan mention some time ago a figure of 100 billion. I don't know the figures, but I think they are huge. I think we're talking enormous amounts of money that are being through rent-seeking within the state-owned enterprises. And I think what is most concerning is that these are not having any developmental effects. A lot of that money is leaving the country. It's not being invested in infrastructure. It's not generating any sort of economic spillover. I think a lot of the money is leaving the country. I think a lot of the money is going into political battles between various political factions. But we don't know fully the scale of it, and I hope the State Capture Commission is going to give us a better sense.
So do you think that this will have a major impact on the popularity of the ANC and the outcome of next year's elections?
It's an interesting question. So from what I'm seeing is that the Ramaphosa victory is proving to be popular amongst urban constituencies. So many people that had become disaffected with the ANC in the large urban areas according to the latest polls, it looks like they are returning to the ANC. The picture outside the large urban areas is much, much more complicated. And this idea, of course, that urban voters are always much more sophisticated than rural voters seems to be off the mark completely here. Rural voters seem to be much more discerning. So it looks like patterns of rural support, and including the support in small towns or even secondary cities, is the picture that is much more complicated. What it does look like, though, is that the ANC going forward into the 2019 election, I think that election is going to be much more contested than we can imagine. Listen, it does depend on the opposition parties getting their act together. The DA seems to be in complete collapse, great opportunity for them, but they seem not to be making much of it.
Ivor, now this book was launched on Tuesday last week in Johannesburg, and tomorrow night it is getting launched in Cape Town.
With Praveen Gordhan.
That's
right. He'll be speaking. I think he's speaking with me, and I think it's happening at Cavendish Books, exclusive books at Cavendish in Cape Town.
Ivor, thank you so very much for coming in and chatting to us.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much. Thanks.
Just to recap, my guest is Professor Ivor Chipkin, and the book is Shadow State, The Politics of State Capture. If you're into politics or simply concerned about what is happening in South Africa at this time, this book is a page-turner. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again soon.